Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in a rather cold Budapest. You wouldn't think spring is here. It's quite chilly. You need a jacket and a sweater to go outside. But at least the sun, well, no, there isn't too much sun either. Um, but the days are a little bit longer. So that's a positive. And speaking of positive, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me on the Tuesday night live stream. I really appreciate it. And obviously, I mean, there are a number of very interesting news developments. We obviously have George is jotting down his weather update. Yeah, I like to provide the weather update, and it's always grim. Um, well, we can start with Ukraine, where Zelensky did another one of his ultimatums today in saying that he insists on speaking to Putin and to nobody else. Now, of course, he really doesn't have any choice in the matter. He's already declared that he will attend Istanbul on Thursday. But he says, I have to talk to Putin. It's got to be Putin. Now, Russia hasn't said at any point that Putin will be in attendance. And when Putin suggested the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine during his 2 a.m. News conference, he only said there'll be direct talks. He never said that I will be attending or that he expects Zelensky to attend. It was when Trump, following this announcement by Putin, it was when Trump said, "Great, that's a fantastic idea. Let's have direct negotiations," that Zelensky made clear that he personally would attend. And then Trump vaguely said, "Well, that'll be a great idea. I mean, maybe I will be there, even though he's currently in the Middle East. But I guess he's not that far from Istanbul, so it wouldn't be that difficult for him to hop on a plane and get to Istanbul." However, it's clear that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, will be in attendance. As will Steve Witkoff. So that's already quite a senior American delegation that will come to Istanbul, which suggests to me that the Russians will have to also send a relatively senior delegation. I would imagine that Lavrov has already spoken to Rubio several times on the phone. He's also met him in Riyadh. And then, of course, Witkoff has already had 4 one-on-one meetings with Putin. So that's, given that very senior American delegation, then I think at a minimum, Lavrov will come to Istanbul. Putin will not come. I mean, there's no reason at all for Putin to come, and he's not going to do it. Now, once Lavrov is there, and once Rubio and Witkoff are there, Zelensky's ridiculous theatrics of I'm not going to talk to anyone other than Putin. I mean, will fall into abeyance. I mean, he's expected to show respect towards the American Secretary of State. You can't just sort of hop on a plane back to Kiev and say, I'm not going to talk to anyone other than Putin. So then the question is, what happens in Istanbul? I would imagine that Lavrov's instructions will be that we aren't going to make any progress until we address the root causes. We're not going to talk about ceasefires. what we're going to talk about is how we're going to address the root causes. Now, the root causes, as I think Lavrov will spell them out, it's not necessarily about the oblasts, so that's obviously one of the issues to discuss, but the root causes are NATO expansion and the Russophobic regime in Kiev. So obviously the root causes will be a change of regime. But and given that the Americans will be present, I would imagine that Lavrov will also bring up the subject that we need a new security architecture in Europe. We can't go on with this constant NATO expansion. I mean, you've seen that it's led to war, and it's going to keep leading to war. We need to have some kind of a new security arrangement. So that's not something that within the power of Zelensky to decide, but it is within the power of the Americans, and the Americans would probably report back to Trump and say that, well, what Lavrov is suggesting is a new security architecture in Europe, a return to Helsinki, the 1975 Security Conference in Europe, um, and therefore it would involve pledges not to expand NATO any further. Um, you know, I would think, Trump is a kind of a bold, adventurous, audacious kind of president. I think this would appeal to him. I think Trump would say, yeah, well, why don't we have a conference of that? That doesn't mean that this conference will be a success. Um, but if Trump puts his weight behind it and say, yeah, I think maybe we need to address the issue of this indefinite NATO expansion, this constant feeling on the part of Russia that it's under threat from NATO. We need to have a conference on that. It's going to be hard for the Europeans to say no to it. I mean, I think their initial response will be no. But if Trump gets behind it, then I think they will have to go along with it. However insincerely, they will have to go along with it. So that's one of the root causes. So there's a root cause, which is the basic insecurity in Europe, and that that which clearly Russia is very concerned with. There's the issue of this anti-Russian regime in Kiev that clearly is a threat to Russia. And then, of course, there's the issue of what happens to the oblasts, which is quite a difficult one. But that at least could be a secondary issue if some of the other issues will be addressed. I mean, if you can get some kind of a conference on security in Europe off the ground, and then there will be some form of pledges. I don't know how they can be done, but some pledges made by NATO that there'll be no further expansion of NATO. Then the issue of the oblasts may take maybe of secondary importance. But I mean, so that's I think what Lavrov will insist upon. If he does show up in Istanbul, that the root causes of this war need to be addressed. Now, given that it'll be the only people there will be Zelensky, the Americans, and then the Russians. So Zelensky is not going to have in his corner what he normally has, which is the Europeans. So he's not going to have Merz. He's not going to have Macron, Starmer, all rooting for him and say, the root cause of this conflict is Russian expansionism, Russian imperialism. That's the root cause. Yeah, we will never solve this problem until Russia withdraws all its forces from Ukraine, and Ukraine is restored to its 1991 borders and sovereignty, and so on. So he won't have that in his corner. So they're not going to be there. They're not going to be in Istanbul. So they can bluster. I mean, we saw how they blustered yesterday that we're gonna unless Russia agrees by close of business on Monday, Russia agrees to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, then we're gonna impose additional sanctions. So that came and went. That's it. That was it became quite irrelevant once Trump threw his weight behind the direct negotiations idea. So essentially, Zelensky is going to be there effectively on his own, without any of the usual support that he would get from NATO. So he's going to have to address Lavrov's issues by himself, and he's going to have to address the whole issue of that he's running a Russophobic regime, and by playing along with NATO, he has essentially gone back on the pledges that Ukraine had made at the time in 1990, which was that when it declared its state sovereignty, that it would not join any military alliances, that it would be a neutral state. And so that he was going to have to address those things by himself. See, the with Rubio and Witkoff, the instructions that they will have received from Trump is that they need to bring this war to an end. I mean, that's already Trump wants. He wants to bring this thing to an end. He really doesn't care about the conditions of about what the terms are. That's why he's basically, Ukraine territorial integrity, 1991 borders, okay. Ukraine loses 20% of its territory, okay. Ukraine loses Crimea, okay. Well, whatever it is, just so long as we can bring this to an end. And that's why I think the Russians know this. And so the question then is this. I mean, we have the oblasts, which have not been fully taken by Russia. So we know that the three of them, the Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, about 70% are under Russian control, and the rest is still under Ukraine control. So that's an issue, and Russia could go on fighting to acquire the rest, but that could take a long time. I mean, I know the talk about how well everything's going on the battlefront, but one always has to take these claims with a pinch of salt. I mean, there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes on among all these military bloggers who tell us how well everything is going for the Russian military. So we have to think about that. But nonetheless, Putin in June of 2024 had said that his conditions for a ceasefire would be a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the four oblasts, plus a commitment by Ukraine to never to aspire to NATO membership. So now that you see, it's kind of a one thing or another. I mean, if I could see Russia maybe giving up on um, um, on the oblast, on taking all of the oblasts in exchange for a firm commitment by Ukraine never to join NATO, and in exchange for um, a security conference coming out with a pledge to that there would be no further NATO expansion. Um, so in other words, it's one or the other. If Russia could say, all right, well, we can end the war on the line of contact, and then maybe we can schedule at some later date issues of territorial exchanges or whatever. But at the very least, then we would need some kind of a security guarantees for Russia, not just security guarantees for Ukraine, but security guarantees for Russia, namely a Helsinki-style conference and pledge to no further NATO expansion. And I think so. So it's one or one. It has to be one or the other. Then Russia has to get that out of it. So um, we got the issue of the oblast, and then you would have to deal with the issue of the regime in Kiev, the Russophobic regime, and then you have the NATO. The Kiev would have to commit itself to neutrality. Would have to write it in its constitution: neutrality, no aspiration to join NATO, and then NATO itself would have to take into account Russia's Russia's security. It's going to be very difficult. That's why that part of it is going to be difficult. That's why it's easier to think, well, why don't we just continue fighting the war? At least we can if we can push the Ukrainians out of these oblasts, the three of those oblasts, then we've at least accomplished that. So it really is the question of whether Russia really wants to make these negotiations a success, and that I think we'll have to see. I mean, I'm still not convinced that Russia is ready to abandon any hope of some kind of a rapprochement with the United States. I mean, they have now this administration with Trump, who is the most positive, the friendliest towards Russia that Russia could ever hope for. Once he's gone, and he will be gone in 4 years, less than 4 years, he will almost certainly be replaced by someone far more hostile to Russia than he is. Yes, it's a possibility that he will be replaced by J.D. Vance, but that's not a done deal. I mean, I like J.D. Vance, and I think J.D. Vance would pursue a very sensible foreign policy, a sensible policy towards Russia. But the polls suggest that Trump's popularity does not translate into popularity for J.D. Vance. So Trump, the people who go to support Trump, the people who go to vote for Trump, will not necessarily support or vote for J.D. Vance. So it's Vance would have quite a task to win an election. So so for Russia, they have here's this window where they can certainly work something out with the United States. The United States has distanced itself from Europe, quite explicitly distanced itself. We talked before about how the media are trying to present it as if the Europeans and the Americans are on the same page. They're all getting fed up with Putin. They're all trying to put pressure on Putin, and that Trump is threatening sanctions against Russia if Russia doesn't accept a 30-day ceasefire. And then we discussed in a few of our podcasts that that simply isn't the case. That this is the media are deliberately distorting what's really happening, and they're doing it because they want to create facts on the ground. They want to create a fait accompli, um, a fait accompli, in which Trump is, um, ipso facto on board with the project, and he can't get himself out. Yeah, he's fed up with Putin. He's imposed sanctions on it, but Trump explicitly said, "I'm not on board with the sanctions," and he's happy with the direct negotiations. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing is, of course, Trump is now in the Middle East, and I have to say it was a very exuberant welcome that he received from Mohammed bin Salman, as was noted by the media that MBS came to meet Trump as he got off his plane, something MBS did not do in the case of Biden. And so it was a very, very friendly um, uh, and so they obviously talked a lot of business, and they talked a great deal of future investment, and then, of course, the high point came when Trump announced that he will be lifting sanctions off Syria. Now, obviously, I don't much like this new regime in Syria. I mean, these this is Al Qaeda guys. I mean, they're backed by Erdogan, and they're Al Qaeda. Um, and uh, but nonetheless, I don't like sanctions. I think sanctions are awful instruments, and they hurt ordinary people. I mean, the pain, which is supposed to be a punishment against leaders, it only hurts ordinary people. I mean, that's always the case with sanctions. So I'm in favor of lifting sanctions, though I don't much like this the new regime in Damascus. So there was a lot of exuberant receptions, and the Saudis are very good at laying on these spectacular welcomes. They know how to flatter Trump, and and Mohammed bin Salman will not forget that Trump really um, saved him at the time of the kind of hysteria over Khashoggi, um, because there was the whole thing with Khashoggi. If you recall, he was this a political player in Saudi Arabia, obviously making a pitch to take over in Saudi Arabia. He played high stakes poker, and he lost. And as a result, he was killed and then sliced and diced in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. Now, there was a lot of outrage at Saudi Arabia. This is kind of cruel and brutal, and then this was somehow used against Trump. That somehow Trump doesn't care about human rights. Trump, is just so expedient. He's transactional, and I think Trump's approach is precisely that he is expedient, he is transactional, And he really didn't care very much about Khashoggi, with some justice, because Khashoggi really wasn't an American citizen, and Khashoggi did not have a green card. Khashoggi was had a column in the Washington Post, but that's the Washington Post. There was no obligation on the part of the United States to undertake major action on behalf of the late Khashoggi. Had he been an American citizen, that would have been a different question. But so there wasn't really any reason. So if you're the president of the United States and you're thinking to yourself, well, here's Saudi Arabia. It's a strategic partner going all the way back to the days of FDR. Um, we make a lot of money through Saudi Arabia. I mean, outrageous sums of money the United States makes through Saudi Arabia, because Saudis just plant all those oil earnings into the U.S. economy and buy up the most sophisticated military hardware, far beyond anything that Saudi Arabia needs. I mean, Saudi Arabia has never fought any wars and wouldn't even know how to fight a war if it did. I mean, but they're getting the most modern American weaponry, because that's what's expected of them, to invest their money into the U.S. economy, and at a substantial markup. They don't get any kind of a discount on any of the fighter jets and AWACS systems that they buy. They pay full rate and then some. So if you're a U.S. president, particularly if you're somebody like Donald Trump, who wants to plant as much money as possible into the U.S. economy, then it makes sense to cultivate good relations with Saudi Arabia. And somebody said, "Oh, no, you can't do that, because look what they did to Khashoggi." And I said, "Well, what do I care what they did to Khashoggi?" And I have to say that in this world of expediency, in this world of realpolitik, and you say, "Hey, I got a $400 billion investment here, and then I got some guy with a name I can't even pronounce, who played some high stakes poker, or high stakes poker, or high stakes coup plotting in Saudi Arabia. He lost out, and he lost his life, which is what happens when you try to stage a coup. You fail, you usually pay with your life." So Trump's attitude at the time was, "Well, I don't really care. I'm not going to jeopardize U.S. interests over this guy Khashoggi," and as a result, I think unlike Biden went on and on about MBS, and that is why MBS gave him a kind of a very cold treatment when he visited Saudi Arabia. It was a couple of years ago. So I think MBS is duly grateful to Trump over that. And look, I mean, these are all large sums of money that we're talking about. I mean, whether it's really going to be $600 billion, I don't know. Who knows? But then nonetheless, this is the kind of sums they're talking about, and there's going to be sums of money being discussed in Qatar and in the United Arab Emirates, and so you have if you're Trump and you're looking at this, you got all these big sums of money, all this investment, and these are all people who see things the way Trump sees them. They say, "Hey, there's a business opportunities. We can make money. Why do we want to go on fighting ancient battles?" So that's on the one hand. And then, Trump is told, "Oh, in the Israeli cabinet, Smotrich, one of those Israeli settlers, He's drawn up plans that apparently the Israeli cabinet has signed off on about annexing Development C on the West Bank, or Block C, I think it's called Block C on the West Bank. So you got this kind of, you know, you know, very narrow-minded approach by Israel. And again, Israel is a net recipient of U.S. funds. So again, like if you're like Trump, you say, hey, look, these the Saudis are planning to invest $600 billion into the U.S. economy, and in the meantime, we are sending whatever the sum is. I mean, they say $4 billion a year. It's a hell of a lot more than $4 billion a year to Israel. Israel, which doesn't even follow our policy, they talk about annexing the West Bank, something we in the United States have said that we're not in favor of. They carry on with their settlement policy, something also the United States has said it's not in favor of. Hasn't done anything much about it, but nonetheless, this official U.S. policy is to be opposed to that. And as I said, well, we go. This is on the one hand, and then this is on the other. And then you have to think at some point, Trump was going to have to make that decision. He's going to, something, he of all people, because he tends to think outside the box, he of all people can say, what does Israel do for us? And he of all people, who thinks about business deals and everybody making money, why jeopardize all of that for a state that is a net recipient of funds from the United States? And then, when he during his first term had talked about a Palestinian state, he actually did talk about, he did actually put forward his version of the two-state solution. I mean, the way he wanted it was that there'd be a kind of economic development first, and then when they would have to deal with the political issues. Nevertheless, it was a plan. But and then Netanyahu essentially, made clear what he thought of Trump's plan. He declared that his plan was Netanyahu's plan was to annex the West Bank. Again, Trump didn't really appreciate that. I mean, you come along with your two-state solution, and then Netanyahu says, "Well, I'm going to annex the West Bank," and that's what they're doing again. They're again talking about annexing a substantial part of the West Bank. So Trump really is enjoying this, talking to people who are talking his language, and he said today that how destructive the neoconservatives were, how destructive the nation builders were. I said, look, here are the Saudis, they created all of this. So I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, if you're an American president and you're looking, well, who's doing something for us, and who isn't, who's giving us headaches and who isn't, then you say, well, here are people who are working with us, who are building things, who are making money, and here are people who are not building anything. They're just bombing and destroying. They've been 18 months. They've been just bombing and destroying and killing. Now, that's a way of thinking. I'm not saying this is what this is the conclusion that Trump will come to. But nonetheless, it would be entirely in keeping with the way he was speaking today, that he would say, "Well, I got this thing here, this mess, this thing that's just going to go on and on and on with Israel. I mean, it's just they're never going to resolve this thing with the Palestinians. It's just going to go on forever." And then I got here, people are talking about the future, constructing, making money, and I've got the neocons on my back who are always trying to get me involved in wars. So, but we'll have to see how that plays out. Now, the other thing that I wanted to bring up before I would talk about the comments that people have made is the kind of a very interesting developments with Hungary and Ukraine, and then of course with Hungary and Romania. So, I mean, as we talked yesterday during the live stream about the supposed spy scandal that Ukraine has unleashed against against Hungary. So Ukraine arrested two people in Transcarpathia, which is a part of Ukraine that had been a part of the Kingdom of Hungary before the Treaty of Trianon, which had assigned it to Czechoslovakia, and that Czechoslovakia lost it after. Well, I mean, they lost it briefly during the the Hitler interregnum when he was returned to Hungary, but then after World War II, Transcarpathia was assigned to the Soviet Union, and then after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine took it. Now, so this Transcarpathia has a very substantial Hungarian population, and the Hungarians of Transcarpathia are not at all happy because they don't really think their language and their culture are much respected by, particularly by the sort of the rabidly nationalist regime in Kiev. And at the same time, Hungary is conducting a consultation with the public as to whether Ukraine should be inducted into the European Union. This is obviously very displeasing to Brussels, which is committed to fast-tracking Ukraine into the EU. And of course, it's very displeasing to Ukraine, which has been very displeased with Hungary, because Hungary has said that it will not send any arms to Ukraine and will not allow the territory of Hungary to be used for the transshipment of arms into Ukraine. That's really been from the beginning. But now Hungary has said, we're going to do everything we can to prevent Ukraine joining the EU. So Ukraine obviously is very unhappy about this, and therefore, it wasn't surprising when they made this arrest. Said that there's a Hungarian spy ring inside Ukraine, and the allegation isn't immediately clear what the spy ring is supposed to be doing, because on the one hand they say, oh, they're trying to find out Ukrainian defense capabilities, but then they're also claiming that the Hungarians are trying to ascertain public opinion in Transcarpathia in anticipation of a possible Hungarian intervention in Transcarpathia. So they're suggesting that Hungary has these irredentist claims on Transcarpathia, so they maybe in the expectation that Ukraine will disintegrate, and then when it disintegrates, Hungary will take a slice. Now, I don't really believe any of that, but there's also the claim that Hungary is gathering intelligence about Ukrainian military capabilities and passing it on to Russia. So that's the most serious allegation. But now Orban made a speech to the nation, or at least it's posted on Facebook, his page to the nation, saying that his main opposition party, that's the TISA party, led by Peter Magyar, is colluding with the Ukrainian intelligence. So that this whole thing has been cooked up about this alleged spies, the Hungarian spying ring inside Transcarpathia. And then, of course, there was the tit for tat expulsions that Hungary expelled 2 Ukrainian diplomats. It claimed the spying, and then Ukraine expelled 2 Hungarian diplomats in a tit for tat. But now Orban claims that the Ukraine, which is seeking to discredit Hungary in the eyes of the world, with a view, ultimately, what they're trying to do here is with a view to sideline Hungary, so that when the EU votes on Ukrainian membership of the European Union, Hungary will not be consulted, because ultimately, to get for an important vote like a new member, you need unanimity. All EU members must agree to support a new member. Now, Orban has obviously made clear he's not going to support ever Ukraine's membership in the EU. And Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign minister, has said, well, we have other ways to get around it. We can basically discount Hungary. We'll know, there are methods that we can discount Hungary, so that we don't really need unanimity. We can just simply ignore Hungary. So that's one thing. But Orban, so locally, there's clearly a plan to discredit Hungary, to ensure that Hungary doesn't get to vote on the matter of Ukraine's membership of the EU, and that this thing is being planned by Brussels, by the Ukrainian intelligence services, in collusion with Peter Magyar's TISA party. So that's quite an interesting development, because it's essentially Orban is accusing the opposition, his main opponents, of treason, of working against the interests of Hungary with a foreign intelligence service, namely the Ukrainian intelligence service. So if this continues, it could well result in the arrest of opposition politicians. I mean, if that's the case, if he has any evidence that opposition politicians have been colluding with Ukrainian intelligence services in order to discredit Hungary, well, that's treason. That's no ands, ifs, and buts. So that'd be kind of an interesting development. And then the other thing is, of course, that there are these elections that are coming up in Romania on Sunday. There's the second round. So if you recall, in the first round, the George Simeon had won nearly 41% of the vote. So he should be able to win in the second round. It's not a done deal. He slipped a bit in the polls. But the problem with Simeon is that he is a Romanian ethno-nationalist. That's how he rose to prominence in Romania, as a very strong opponent of the Hungarians in Romania, because Romania has a very substantial Hungarian population. Again, a consequence of the Treaty of Trianon, which is that Transylvania was taken away from Hungary and handed to Romania. But Transylvania, of course, is the home to many Hungarians, and Transylvania lives, shall we say, in the heart of many Hungarians. They still dream of Transylvania. But Romanian nationalists, really don't like these ethnic Hungarians, and they don't like these ethnic Hungarian political parties, and they often campaign against Hungarian ethnic separatism, this kind of Hungarian culture, displays of Hungarian flags. Orban gave them the vote, so these Hungarians who live in Romania and in Slovakia, they have the vote. They can vote in Hungarian elections. So all of that was has always been attacked by these nationalists like George Simeon, not by Georgescu. Georgescu was a sovereignist, so a Romanian sovereignist. He just wanted Romania to enjoy sovereignty and not to be told what to do by NATO and the EU. So he pursued a Romania first policy. He wasn't an ethno-nationalist, somebody who basically doesn't like minorities. But that was George Simeon. So when he won the first round of the election, Orban said nothing. Orban's usually he'd be jumping up and down, with excitement when a political candidate out of favor with Brussels would win. He didn't. He said nothing about Simeon. And then Simeon announced that he wants to be Romania's Viktor Orban. He sees himself as Orban. I mean, sometimes Simeon says, "I see myself as a Donald Trump. I'm the Trump of Romania. Make Romania great again." And it's what you feel. What's your foreign policy? My foreign policy is just to stick with Trump. Whatever Trump wants, Romania is going to do it. If Trump wants us to increase our military expenditure to 5% of GDP, then we're going to do it. I just follow Donald Trump. But he's also said that his hero is Giorgia Meloni, who's nothing if not pragmatic. Wins an election, but now is besties with Ursula von der Leyen. But then he turned around. So because Simeon needs some support from the Hungarians of Romania, he kind of turned around and said, "Yeah, I'm going to be the Viktor Orban of Romania. I'm basically I'm not going to be told what to do. I'm going to be pursuing Romania's interests. We're just, it's going to be, I support Orban's vision of a Europe of sovereign nation states. That's my vision, and I support a Europe of Christendom. Again, so these are all Europe of nation states, Europe of Christendom. These are Orban's terms, and that Orban kind of responded. So up until then, he hadn't really said anything about Simeon. He said, "Yeah, okay, well, that sounds good. I mean, I can work with this." But when he said that, then the Hungarians, the party of the Hungarians in Romania, they were a little upset about this. They said, "No, you can't. I mean, Simeon is the enemy of the Hungarian people. You can't support Simeon. He's the enemy of the Hungarians. He always has been." And so they said they took objection to Orban seeming to endorse Simeon, and then Orban kind of walked it back a little bit and said, "Well, okay, well, I don't want to interfere in the Romanian election. I'm going to take my cue from the party of the Hungarians in Romania. I mean, if they say, that Simeon is the enemy of the Hungarian people, well, I mean, I guess they know better. My only concern is the Hungarians in Romania, the Seke Hungarians, the Hungarians of Transylvania. Um, and so as things stand, Orban has kind of slightly walked back his support of Simeon. And so therefore, the question arises: if Simeon does win, will there now be a kind of a Romania, Hungary, Slovakia axis in Europe opposed to NATO? I have my doubts. I just think that Simeon is just an opportunist. I think he was an opportunist when he was an ethno nationalist. He then switched, didn't do very well back in the first round of the election, the one that was won by um, uh, Georgescu. He came in fourth, but now once the Constitutional Court ruled Georgescu as ineligible because he said, never really explained why he was ineligible. Once he was ruled ineligible, somehow Simeon embraced Georgescu and suddenly he became a sovereignist. But he's basically, I mean, he's an ethno-nationalist and talked sort of a lot of strange stuff about returning Romania to its 1940 borders, which means that he does have irredentist claims on Ukraine and Moldova. So, like essentially, northern Bessarabia and southern Bukovina, he thinks are part of Romania's historic territory, and which is why kind of he's been banned from Ukraine and from Moldova. So but now he's doing the whole, I'm just a Viktor Orban, I'm a Donald Trump, I'm a Viktor Orban, and where before he was, I'm just a Georgia Maloney. To be honest, I actually I'm not sure he is going to win on Sunday. He just doesn't seem a particularly impressive political figure. But that's I don't think anyone needs to panic in Brussels. Needs to panic too much by by any and the prospect. Even if he does win, I don't think he is going to pose too much of a threat to Brussels. I think Georgescu, I think, did pose a threat, and that's why I wanted to Georgescu out. But Simeon just is not at all impressive. But we'll see. Anyway, let's take a look at our friends on our locals page, and this is the point that the dogs, these ferocious dogs, are trying to make. I mean, these ferocious dogs and saying, well, you gotta contribute to the tip jar. I mean, it just has to be done. This is what they're concerned with. I'm not, because what's money to me? I mean, I don't need money, but the dogs, they're a little different. They for them, there's no meaning just to kind of work for no pay. That's just not part of the canine business model. So you've got to work, pay, and that's it. Piece of work, pay. I mean, that's the way they think, and I can't really. I don't have the strength to argue against them. Anyway, Judy Hotchkiss. Judy, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, as always, for your contributions and for your generosity. I really, really appreciate it, Judy. Anyway, Judy says, Russia has announced they are sending Lavrov to Istanbul. Oh, so they have announced it. I mean, I was speculating today that whether I mean, it was obvious, as I was saying when we began, that once Rubio said that he would attend Istanbul, and then Witkoff was also going to attend Istanbul. Then it was clear that the Russians, couldn't really send anyone below the level of Lavrov. I mean, you'd have to show respect for Rubio, so Lavrov would have to attend. But Zelensky was insisting that Putin be there. I mean, it's quite ridiculous on his part because Putin isn't going to be there, and he can't just get back on a plane and fly back to Kiev, because that would obviously show disrespect for Marco Rubio. So that Trump really would not appreciate him just walking out on Rubio. So Zelensky is going to be there, and as I was saying, Zelensky is not going to have anyone in his corner. He's not going to have Merz, Starmer, Macron, and the rest of them. They're not going to be there for him. No Mark Rutte and the rest of that gang. So he's going to be there. He's going to have Rubio and Witkoff. Their terms of reference are that Trump wants to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. And then, of course, Lavrov, who will be saying we need to address the root causes of this war. No speechifying about unilateral ceasefires. I mean, no speechifying about unconditional ceasefires. We need to address the root causes of this war. It's going to root causes, and Rubio is going to say, okay, well, fine, let's talk about the root causes. So there is a prospect for some serious discussions here. I mean, if Starmer and the rest were present, then that would be hopeless. There'd be no serious discussions. But here, there's now a prospect for some serious negotiations. Anyway, Judy goes on. Reports are that the U.S. is sending Kellogg and Witkoff. I didn't see that Kellogg was going. Kellogg is, of course, completely useless. But I have seen that Witkoff is going with Rubio. I think Kellogg needs to stay away. But I think Kellogg is just so ineffectual that even if Kellogg were there, I don't think it would make any real difference. He's very much junior figure to Rubio and Witkoff. Rubio is already scheduled to be in Turkey this Thursday to attend an informal NATO foreign ministers meeting. Yeah. Did the Russians not know this before Putin made his announcement explicit to start negotiation? Was everything arranged with Washington beforehand? I don't know whether anything was arranged with Washington. I mean, it's possible. My view was that Putin felt that he needed a response to the kind of ultimatum that was issued on Saturday by the coalition of the irrelevant. So and therefore he came, okay, fine, we'll have the direct negotiations. And then Trump responded very quickly, saying, "Hey, big week coming up in this Thursday." So it's possible that there had been some kind of feelers put out, and so Putin knew that Trump would respond positively. But to be honest, and we looked through all of the postings over the past few days, and it was clear that Trump was distancing himself from the Europeans. Trump was, and there were we discussed last week when in Munich, J.D. Vance used the word obsession. We've abandoned our obsession with this 30-day ceasefire. So obsession means essentially you've kind of it's silly. It's not something it's worth hanging your hat on. So it's an obsession. So therefore, it was clear that there was a major distance separating the European position from the American position. So it was the Europeans who went out of their way and said, "Oh, we must have a 30-day ceasefire, and if we don't get it, we're going to have sanctions." And then Trump issued that truth in which he said, "Ideally, we will have a ceasefire." Ideally means absolutely nothing. I mean, and he made clear that he was distancing himself from what the Europeans were doing. And then when he did talk about the sanctions, he said once a ceasefire is in place, whoever breaks it will have to suffer sanctions. So, but the media, of course, spun it as if somehow Trump is saying to the Russians, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, we're going to hit you with sanctions, when he absolutely categorically didn't say that. That was what the Europeans said. So I think, to me, it seems as if Putin had seen that there would be an opening there to exacerbate the divisions between Europe and the United States. But it's possible that there was some kind of coordination going on behind the scenes. So, I mean, it would certainly make sense that there was. The Europeans clearly have been made to look foolish. Even the Guardian admitted in today's paper that, basically Trump had just pulled the rug from under their feet by essentially endorsing the Russian plan for direct negotiations. And again, this J.D. Vance said, we want to see direct negotiations. So he said direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And Vance said about this obsession with the 30-day ceasefire. There was an opening there. Any kind of deft diplomat would see, hey, there's an opening here, and then to seize it. So that's how I read it. But it's possible that we'll find out in due course that there was some coordination taking place between Washington and Moscow. Anyway, thank you, Judy, for that. Dale Owens, good to see you again, Dale. We kind of missed you. Hi, George. Did you once say you had dealings with Kingsley Amis? How do you rate him and his work? Yeah, I did. Kingsley Amis was kind of a major novelist, really of post 1945 England, consistently successful. Both among readers, all his novels sold well, and critics liked it. He was friends with my father. He at the time that he became quite political, and so he he and my father had friends, and so we're friends, and so I was occasionally invited, with my family to spend time at his house with his then wife, Elizabeth Jane Howard, and he things one could say, he consumed extraordinary amounts of alcohol. I was very young then. I was just, I guess, 16. I was about 16 years old at the time. So, but I was certainly stunned by. I've never seen anyone consume that amount of alcohol, and he as a person, he was very kind of standoffish. I mean, he liked to be surrounded by people, but he himself was quite standoffish, quite cold. Didn't really say very much, but he really needed people around him. Even as he was just simply drinking these huge quantities of alcohol, but but he needed people around him. He was respectful towards my father, so he was obviously respectful towards me, as because I was my father's son. And I mean, in terms of his work, he he found a formula. He had a formula that he stuck with. He wrote that his novel, the novel that essentially catapulted him to fame, which was Lucky Jim, and then he didn't really depart from that formula. He wrote that sometime in the I guess in the mid 1950s, maybe around 1954. So yeah, and then he went on writing to the time of his death, 1995. And he would probably produce about a novel a year, and then they always sold well. because the his readers, I think, appreciated that formula. It's a kind of the English comic novel. It wasn't uproariously funny. Nothing he wrote was ever uproariously funny, but he had a certain style. And he liked to play on words. He liked to play on people's names. He had a certain sarcastic um, narrative style. Um, and and a kind of ironic style. Whenever you read it, it's always entertaining enough, but you didn't really think there was anything real substance to it, nor was it uproariously funny in the way, let's say, the best of Evil and War was uproariously funny, or the best of P.G. Wodehouse. P.G. Wodehouse was consistently, I mean, uproariously funny. So he had a certain he was very very nice style of writing, but I think when you read it, you always felt a little bit as if you read something a little insubstantial. Um, and but the thing about him is that he became this personage in British life. I mean, he was always on television, and uh, and he kind of now created this persona for himself. He would often come on a talk show with a glass in his hand. I mean, it was a glass of wine or a gin and tonic or whatever it was he was drinking. He would go on the stage with this a glass on his hand, and then he would he would sort of lay the law down. Who's a good writer, who's not a good writer, what's good writing, what's bad writing, what's good English, what's bad English, and people would just lap it up, because he was now, this major literary, figure in London, and we're supposed to, hang on his every word. So he was a. I mean, I think he was a talented writer. I mean, I don't know whether you get that much out of his books. But then his life kind of, as he grew older, it sort of became quite strange because he as I said, he really hated being alone, and you know continued drinking huge quantities of alcohol, which made him, of course, a rather difficult person to be with. So he moved in with his first wife and her husband. So I think that I mean, I don't think it was any kind of a menage a trois or anything like that, but he kind of lived with his first wife and her husband. Presumably, the money came from him because he continued being very successful, and he just continued being this a literary figure, always invited on TV shows and invited to parties and so on. Um, People always talked about his politics and he became very conservative, but he really wasn't that political. He was briefly quite political during that phase when he was friends with my father, and I think my father kind of provided him with ammunition as he got himself into political debates, which he wasn't really particularly equipped to, but he needed some political ammunition, and so if you think about that time of the sort of late 60s, early 70s, people would criticize the United States. They say, oh, well, and so on. So how do you deal with criticisms of the United States? Well, back then, the way you dealt with it says, well, what about the Soviet Union? Look at what the Soviet Union does. And so somebody would criticize whatever, what America was doing in Vietnam, or America, what America was doing to blacks or whatever. And then they say, well, how do you respond to that? Well, you respond to by saying, "Well, look what the Soviet Union is doing." And I think that's where I think that's why I think my father kind of provided him with some arguments that he could use, because he was always getting invited on talk shows to talk about politics. It was quite extraordinary that they'd always bring him on, and somebody who wasn't that political. He was never that interested in politics, but all they really wanted to talk about, I mean, they didn't really want to talk about literature or anything like, what's your view of Jane Austen or anything like that. They want to talk about politics. What do you think of Margaret Thatcher? What do you think of Harold Wilson or anything like that? So that's that. They bring on this literary figure, and all they can do is talk politics. But that, when people say, "Oh, he became very conservative," in a way, he did, but fundamentally, his conservatism was that he was culturally very conservative, in the sense that he didn't like people misusing words. He didn't like people speaking bad English. He didn't like people's bad accents. He didn't like trendy and fashionable ideas. Uh, it's like he didn't like people coming along with saying all kinds of stupid things that politicians do, and that was his more or less his political thing. He just was immensely irritated by stupid people going on television and saying a lot of stupid things, and that was his kind of conservatism. Plus, in at that time, in particularly in Britain, and of course and also in the United States, there was this massive expansion of university education. So before university, if you got to universities, you had to be a smart person. But once you expanded this universities, then a lot of very dim people would get in, and of course then the universities would hire a lot of very dim people to be university lecturers and professors and so on. And so this is again something he would continually talk about. There's Mickey Mouse subjects at university, Mickey Mouse administrators at universities, Mickey Mouse professors, and so on. So he was more as a cultural conservative. I mean, he didn't care much about Margaret Thatcher or Thatcher's policies, but so to the extent he's a conservative, it's just his culturally he was very conservative. So that's. But in terms of what's his him and his work, I mean, I guess he would be regarded as kind of the major literary figure of I think post World War II England. Um, and if you read his novels, they're entertaining enough. Um, but to be honest, I mean, if I want to be entertained, I would much rather read B.G. Woodhouse. But anyway, Dale, thanks very much, and thank you for posting a kind of documentary about Amis that was uh, that was produced to coincide with his memoirs that he published in 1991, in which he kind of um, he really dished the dirt on some of his old friends. So many people were a little disappointed with his memoirs because he was so nasty um, to old friends. He recounted very unflattering tales, and I don't know. It didn't look good when you tell stories, and particularly about people who were already dead, and so couldn't really respond. Uh, uh, you know, whether these stories were true or not. Anyway, Ergos. In retrospect, Putin should have said, quote, "We will send the same team from 2022. What do you think of Trump apparently sending representatives to all but guarantee failure?" Right. Well, first of all, I mean, if you're sending Rubio and Witkoff, that's a pretty senior team. That's pretty much next to the president, that's about as senior as you can get. So I don't think it's going to guarantee failure. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily they're going to get it. I mean, the what's most important when you have a meeting like this is that there's some progress made, that there's some agreement to uh, continue with these negotiations. So if they can deal with what Lavrov was saying, we need to address the root causes. That's what Lavrov is going to keep saying. We need to address the root causes, which is the regime in Kiev, NATO's continued expansion, and basically we have to deal. Fine, we'll talk about Ukrainian security, but we need to talk about Russian security. And then the issue of the oblasts that can be discussed at a later date. But the most important thing, I think, when Lavrov talks about the root causes, because the oblasts are not the root causes. The root causes are the threat to Russia. If at least they can get somewhere, if Rubio and Witkoff can promise that we're gonna work on something, we're gonna work on some new security conference, some new security architecture, and that might appeal to Trump. He wants some grandiose deal. That this will be the 50 years from Helsinki. It is 50 years now to this year that the Helsinki Accords were signed. So 50 years on, we're going to work out some new security architecture. Probably is going to be difficult. I mean, but this might appeal to Trump. So I don't necessarily think it will fail. I don't think the Russians want it to fail. Because if it fails, if everyone just walks away with nothing and the war continues, then essentially, then any real prospect of a speedy resolution of this war really goes out of the window. Trump will probably then escalate America's involvement, and whoever comes after Trump will be worse for Russia. I mean, Trump is almost like a historic opportunity for Russia because he doesn't have anything against Russia. He's almost unique in American politics and not having any animus towards Russia. So I don't think the Russians want this to fail. That doesn't mean it won't fail, but I don't think it's guaranteed that it will fail. So if the Russians, because I think this idea that if the Russians are going to go in and say we don't care about anything, we're just going to go ahead and continue with the war, I don't think they're going to go in with that attitude, because I think that would not be an optimal position for the Russians to take, and I think because Trump would certainly not appreciate it if it seems as if Russia is not serious about bringing the war to an end. Anyway, Marx 2023 says, George, the trade war is no more than a circus. The clowns Trump, Bess, and Lutnick capitulated the Chinese communists. No, they did not capitulate. Read the article in the Financial Times, which made clear that it was the Chinese that wanted this meeting. The Chinese, when they were in Washington, sought out Besant, and they wanted these negotiations in Switzerland. So there's no capitulation. 30%. The tariffs are 30%. They've kept 30% tariffs on Chinese goods. The tariffs on American goods are down to 10%. So what's the capitulation? 30%. There are 30% tariffs on Chinese goods, plus all the tariffs on steel and aluminum products. Anyway, China now has a 10% tariff on American imports. It was only 3% before, but that's okay. No rare earths will be going to America. China not buying American farm products that they already replaced. So is the surplus country came out on top. So, look, China did not come out on top. First of all, the negotiations are ongoing. Trade negotiations are things that are very complicated. Then they will, 90-day hiatus will obviously be used for negotiations. But the important thing that you have to, and I keep repeating this, China cannot win this war. And he cannot win this war, a trade war, because what he does is not going to be acceptable to anyone else in the world. If you've got a per capita GDP when you're number 75 in the world, so you're number 75, you're among the poorest countries in the world in terms of consumption, and you purport to be the number one economic power in the world. You're challenging the number one economic power through manipulating trade, through a huge artificial trade surplus. No one's going to put up with it, and that's the problem that China faced, which is that whoever is president, whether Trump or anyone else, is going to say, we're not going to put up with this. You can't have a per capita GDP number 75 in the world. In other words, you're a very poor country, and you're running this trade surplus with us. You're trying to wipe out our industries. You're trying to put our people out of work. It's the classic case of beggar thy neighbor, the very thing that all trade economists said is absolutely undesirable. And Judy, who often talks about the Bretton Woods, the whole point of Bretton Woods was that they would get away from a system of beggar thy neighbor, which is that somehow one country is always going to be running a trade surplus, and another country is always going to be running a trade deficit. So, in other words, one country which was based on low wages, subsidized exports, no welfare infrastructure, so everybody is obligated to save as much money as they can, currency manipulation, whatever, and thereby they get a surplus, and therefore capital moves away from the high wage countries into the low wage countries. It's not acceptable. You can't base an international trading system like that, and that I think is the problem that China has, and China cannot win this. It absolutely cannot win this. I mean, it's in no way, shape, or form the equal of the United States. I mean, when you have a comparison where the United States has the reserve currency, China doesn't have a reserve currency. China doesn't have an international currency. People aren't stocking up on yuan. People want dollars, and there's a reason why people want dollars. They don't want the yuan. So it's just it cannot happen. Now, I'm not saying that it's undesirable. I think it is desirable that there be multipolarity and that there be other economic and political powers in the world. What I just object to is when people already tell us, "Hey, China is already the number one economy in the world." It isn't, and China cannot fight a trade war against the United States. Anyway, Ergo says, I don't see how that works. For one thing, Witkoff has already conveyed all of that to Trump from Putin, so there's really nothing new that's really new. Also, and meanwhile, the purpose of the Istanbul round, the bilateral discussion with Ukraine, is lost. Okay, as such, none of this resolves the short-term military situation. Seems to me this only results in failure. Well, that may be the case. I mean, it's quite possible that this will fail. I don't think the Russians want this to fail. I don't think it's in Russia's interest for it to fail. I think it's in Russia's interest for there to be some kind of a discussion, an ultimate settlement of the security issues in Europe. I mean, the war will continue, and that doesn't mean the war. I mean, the war isn't just going to stop. But it will stop at some point when it seems like there's some progress towards addressing Russia's core issues. The oblasts were not Russia's core issues. How do we know that they weren't Russia's core issues? Because they didn't. They weren't core issues during the Minsk process. During the Minsk process, Russia's objective was that these territories be integrated within Ukraine. Russia did not say these territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, are part of the Russian Federation. So during all those years, Russia made no claims on Donetsk and Lugansk. At Istanbul, Russia still didn't say that Donetsk and Lugansk are part of the Russian Federation. The agreement that was initialed by Ukraine only dealt with the issue of NATO, the presence of foreign forces on Ukraine territory, demilitarization, and the issue of the territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, would be discussed subsequently in a bilateral format between Putin and Zelensky. There was nothing in the in Istanbul saying that they are now part of the Russian Federation. They said that the final status would be discussed bilaterally between Putin and Zelensky. Now, so given this history, you'd say, well, actually, the Russians could be quite flexible on this. I mean, I don't know what terms they would agree to, but they could be quite flexible. Seeing that up until September of 2022, they hadn't made the claim that this is they are part of the Russian Federation. That was the first time they'd ever made that claim that this was part of the Russian Federation. So there could be flexibility. Where I don't think there'll be any flexibility is on the issue of Russian security. Russia's long-term security concern. And Ergo says, and it also results in Trump owning it, which we all know is a mistake. Well, I mean, I think it's everyone's jumping the gun here about how Russia owning this, Trump owning this war. Trump doesn't own this war. This isn't Trump's war. And the arms that are being sent to Ukraine, these are all arms that were promised by Biden. I mean, so there's a process of inertia whereby this is the arms that continue to send, but ultimately Trump hasn't gone to Congress and asked for more arms. Right? Trump hasn't sent in any new arms. He may, I'm not saying he won't, but he may. But there's inertia here. So that it isn't yet Trump's war. I mean, I know it sounds cute to say, oh, it's Trump's war now. It isn't Trump's war, and that's why he's able to engage in this diplomacy, because it's still not his war. He can still say, I didn't start this. This is Biden's war. This is Obama's war. This is Biden's war. And I'm the one who's trying to end it. Marx says, Trump cares nothing for Ukraine. Okay. Project 2025 is the agenda. No matter what Trump pretends to think, Russia's in the driving seat. They are winning, and the Americans and NATO are losing. I mean, this is where everything gets so, wildly over the top, that the Americans are losing. I said it, I don't know how many times. You're never losing if you're not losing any lives. So, you're making the other person lose lives. If it's the other person who's losing lives, it's the other person who's breaking a sweat while you're not, then you're not losing. And ultimately, we're not anywhere near the end of this conflict, so it's talking about winning and losing is quite pointless. When something is over, when the deal is signed, the guns stop firing, then we can talk about who won and who lost. But until then, this is just it's just a waste of time. It's like it's at the level of a sports newscast. And then Mark says, God, George, what are you talking about? The four oblasts are Russian period. They will be liberated by force. Russia has priced it to the finish on the battlefield. How do you know that? How do you know that? I mean, you make these claims. I mean, did somebody tell you that? I mean, it's like Russia will do this. Russia will do that. Did Putin tell you that? Did Lavrov say that? I don't know if they're going to do that. We'll see. As I just explained, up until September 2022, so from 2014 to 2022, Russia was committed to the Minsk process. The Minsk process that said that these will be integrated into Ukraine. So all those years, Russia seemed to accept that this was, sovereign Ukrainian territory. All they wanted was a change in the constitution whereby Donetsk and Lugansk will have special status. So how do we know that this is now Russia is absolutely firmly, unconditionally committed that all four oblasts, every single inch of these four oblasts are forever and ever part of Russia? I don't know that that's the case. If at Istanbul they said that the issue of the oblast will be discussed bilaterally between Putin and Zelensky, that doesn't sound like Russia had made any real decision at that stage about the oblast. So, where I think Russia is most concerned, and where I think Russians have spoken out most strongly, has not been about the oblast. They've spoken out most strongly about NATO, the expansion of NATO, and the threat NATO poses to Russia, and a hostile regime, the possibility. And so anyway. Mark says, Trump, you're upset, George. No fly past of Trump from the Saudis, unlike Putin's. Well, they got, he got a lot of, a lot of flattery. I mean, you're really not going to sit arguing here about the huge, lavish display that the Saudis put on for Trump. So, I look. What I would say is that Trump is an interesting figure. He's an interesting, consequential figure. He's a politician who has arrived with an ambitious domestic and foreign policy agenda. Most politicians aren't like that. I mean, I've seen many politicians come and go in my life. Most of them don't do anything. They come to power. And basically, once they reach power, they just do what everyone else always did. They wait for their civil servants to come with their papers. They tell them what their policy should be, and then the central bankers tell them what the policy should be. And they look at what legislation's in the hopper. They don't do anything. They're just basically, hey, finally I've won election. I've lost all these elections before. Now I finally won, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. Trump is different. Is that he has an ambitious agenda. Now, do I think he'll succeed? Probably not. But I have to admire someone who's just goes one ambitious plan after another, whether it's something to do with the price of drugs, whether it's internationally, whether with the negotiations in Istanbul, whether it's taking on the universities. I mean, whatever it is, you're saying, well, okay, well, he's trying to do something, and we'll see what if any of this is going, how any of this is going to work out. And then Judy says, Trump's announcement today about the most favored nation prices for U.S. drugs to be priced at European rates is sure to further infuriate the Europeans. Absolutely. In other words, he's telling them, you're going to have to cough up some money for this research and development. I mean, we have our pharmaceutical companies. They invest in research and development, but it seems like it's only American consumers who have to pay for it. And now he's going to say, no, the Europeans are going to have to pay for this research and development. And then, yeah, the Europeans are going to see, who see drug prices raised by at least 20%, while U.S. prices are dramatically lowered. Yeah, no more U.S. subsidies for no more U.S. subsidy for European healthcare. That's absolutely right. That's exactly um, what Trump uh, and Jay Bhattacharya and Kennedy was saying that yeah, that's it. It is kind of ridiculous that drugs in America, cost so much more everywhere else. And then said, oh well, they've got this fantastic healthcare in Europe or and so well, yeah, that's really nice because Americans have to spend so much more on medication. That's okay. You can always have this wonderful system when somebody else is picking up the tab. So, I mean, the pharmaceuticals is one thing. The other thing, of course, is what you're spending on your military. I mean, now the Europeans are sort of grinding, trying to get it up to 2%. They still haven't got it. Germany still hasn't got it up to 2%. Yeah, you can have a nice welfare system, you can have a nice healthcare system when somebody else is, you know, footing the bills, whether it's on drugs or whether it's on military. So again, this is a something that I have to admire Trump for. Um, Marty, always very good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much, Marty, as always, for your generosity. Really appreciate it. Um, and thank you always, as always, for your really interesting contributions. Always some fascinating footage that you post. Mojo, 1982, good to see you again. George, I hope you're well. Thank you. So, same to you. When analyzing Russia's relations with the West, the domestic factor is overlooked. Yes, okay. There are very powerful pro Western forces in Russia, yes, who are desperate to reconcile with the US and Europe. Absolutely right. No, no, those are very, very powerful forces. Putin was installed as PM and then president by these pro-Western forces. Absolutely, and that was the initial promise of Putin that he will indeed be pro-Western. Then associated with Yeltsin and then associated with Yeltsin and Berezovsky. Putin was liberal and pro-Western in his first term as president. I agree. Putin's reluctance to escalate the war is because he has to placate these pro-Western forces. I couldn't agree more. That's absolutely excellently put. It's very important to realize that and the people who say, oh, Russia's just going to go, they don't care about anything, they're just going to march on to Kiev, destroy Ukraine, destroy NATO, and they don't care what the Americans think or whatever. That's not the way. I mean, there are people in Russia who do think like that, but but there's very different strands of opinion within Russia, and there are absolutely very strongly pro-Western forces who want to get back to in a normal life with a normal relations with the West. Now, we may think that that's reprehensible. Russia should go its own way. Forget about the West. It's all just, Xi. Just ignore everyone. Just have good relations with Xi. Well, the problem is that's not the way many Russians think. Many Russians, at all levels of society, they like the West. They want to be a part of the West. They like traveling to the West. They like buying Western goods. They like looking at Western movies. They like doing Western shopping. They're using their credit cards to buy fancy Yves Saint Laurent clothes. They want to do. They want to be able to go back to Milan and buy a fancy stuff in Milan and all that. That's a very strong constituency, and particularly among young people who if you tell them, well, you don't have to worry about Europe and being able to go to Paris and Rome. You can always go to Beijing and Shanghai. You can always go to Ho Chi Minh City. I don't think the young Russians really find that appealing. I think they like online shopping. They like doing this online shopping, and they can't do the online shopping anymore. So I think that you're absolutely right, Mojo. That's a very important strand of thought, and that's why I think there are divisions within the Russian leadership as to why can we go all out, and thereby risk a permanent rift with the West, um, or maybe we can work something out. That's why I think that we'll have to see how these negotiations go. I mean, I don't think. Well, we'll have to see. I don't think we should just rule out straight away any prospect of some kind of a deal. I think Russia has shown in the past that it is willing to deal and willing to compromise. But we'll see. We'll see on what issue they would be willing to compromise. And then so anyway, Mojo says, "Hi George, can you and Peter please invite John Helmer?" Yeah, we tried inviting John Helmer, but that hasn't really worked out. So yeah, I mean, I thought um, but I have mixed feelings about Helmer, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's a good idea having him on. I think it would be a good idea to have him on, but that hasn't so far hasn't worked out with Helmer. But we'll see. Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. Anne Marie's kind of resident musical expert. She's herself a distinguished musician, and I always look forward to her comments about the postings for the Gaggle Music Club. So the last week on the Gaggle Music Club, I posted Gustav Holst's The Planets, which it received a mixed response, which is good. But I hope Anne Marie you'll be able to add your own expertise to it. So see whether you like it or not. So, but anyway, thank you as always, Anne Marie, for your generosity. And then Judy says RFK. Oh, let me go back. Where was I? Judy Hodgkin says RFK Jr. Gives an eloquent explanation of the drug deal. Yeah, I saw that. That was very good. That was a very good meeting with all of them. I mean, Jay Bhattacharya is always he always speaks very well, and Dr. Oz. So that was good. I mean, it was quite extraordinary that they all I don't know to what extent Americans were even aware of the fact that somehow American consumers are paying whatever 5, 6, 7, 8 times more than for the same drugs as Europeans are, and and you figure, well, why does that come about? So, well, it's a clever little scheme whereby it's this research and development is the prices are carried by Americans, which is okay if you've got a nice health insurance plan. The health insurance takes care of this exorbitant drug prices, but if you don't have that and you're paying out of pocket, then it is really burdensome. And there's no question. And that's why people are driven into bankruptcy, if they get ill and they're not able to afford their, the chemotherapy, the cancer. So not only you have cancer, but you're driven into bankruptcy. It's an absolute outrage. All right. W. Baker, thank you so much. He says, one can only imagine the kvetching and clutching of pearls if Orban arrests the opposition for treason. Romania and Slovakia will be memory hold, some shekels for the beasts. Yeah, I don't know whether he will arrest them, but it all depends on how this develops. I mean, these are serious charges. What he said today, that the opposition is colluding with the Romanian intelligence services in order to discredit Hungary in order that Hungary will be discounted within the European Union. These are serious charges. I mean, if you have any evidence for that, then you need to show this evidence, and then you need to start making some arrests. You can't just have political figures, the opposition, colluding with in the intelligence services of another country. So, but you're right. I mean, there will indeed be a lot of clutching of pearls if that were to happen. Um, Ergo says, I'm very curious about your beverage. Tea, something else? Um, whenever this comes up, I always quote Frank Sinatra and say, "This isn't tea." Um, so anyway, um, and then uh, Robert, always good to see you. Robert says, yeah, Dale says, I was wondering what the 54. 54 was Lucky Jim. Is when that's when Kingsley Amis wrote Lucky Jim. Um, and from that moment on, really, he enjoyed pretty much continuing success, and that's quite impressive. I mean, there are plenty of people who write a novel and just have this one novel in them. They hailed as a great literary talent, and then and then that's it. They just had that one novel. So, one has to have some kudos to somebody who has a consistently successful literary career. He's able to write novel after novel after novel, all of which are commercially successful and by and large critically successful. So that takes doing. Whether I like them or I enjoy them is a different matter. But I'd have to admire the accomplishment. Robert, very, very good to see you, Robert. Thank you as always for your generosity. Robert says President Putin recently pointed out that Ukrainians are hunting people on the street like dogs. Yeah, he did say that. Yeah, to fill draft quotas. Yeah. Apropos of the Transcarpathian Hungarians, and by the way, Peter nailed it when he said this has to be the coolest geographic name of all time. Reports are that much harsher raids and higher quotas are being carried out in minority-heavy areas. Like, well, you're using the Zakarpattia term. This is not the appropriate term, Transcarpathian, with lots of Hungarians and Romanians. Have you ever seen such reports in the Western media? You're absolutely right. Those what you're saying, there have been a lot of complaints from the national minorities that they are being corralled into the armed forces, and that it's quite brutal, and they're essentially forced to fight for a state that they really don't identify with. I mean, they didn't choose to be a part of Romania, a part of rather of Ukraine, and that's really the problem with these when they created these states after World War One, and then they essentially restored them after World War Two, is that nobody ever asked the opinions of the people who were taken from one state and dumped in another state. And so the Hungarians and the Romanians, um, they have to put up with being in Ukraine, and they have to essentially put up with the Ukrainian state rather, coming after them and trying to throw them into the front. At least Russia, you don't get sent to the front. You have to actually volunteer. But that's not in Ukraine. They're not volunteers. They're actually being sent to the front with a very high likelihood of death or permanent maiming. It's interesting. I mean, we talk about Simeon, and I was speaking quite harshly about him. But what's interesting is that nobody ever really says, "Hey, these Romanians who are living in Ukraine or these Romanians in Moldova, nobody really ever asked them where they want to live. And the same applies to Crimea. When these people talk about, well, Crimea is part of Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine. That's an integral part of Ukraine for no reason other than at the time of the dissolution of the USSR, Crimea was a part of Ukraine. But nobody had ever asked the Crimeans, where do you want to be? Do you want to be a part of Russia or do you want to be a part of Ukraine? Well, that's the last thing anyone ever asks. The Crimeans are just simply picked up like a sack of potatoes by Nikita Khrushchev and were dumped into the administrative oblast of Ukraine. And but nobody asked the Crimeans, and so that's so that's really the issue here, is that they make all these decisions on behalf of people, and nobody ever asked the Hungarians who live in Ukraine, where would you rather be? You want to be a part of Ukraine? You want to be a part of Hungary? Well, given they speak Hungarian, they're part of the Hungarian culture. I mean, that kind of that that answers itself. And anyway, anyway, and Judy says J.D. Vance said that to Zelensky's face about that to Zelensky's face at the famous White House meeting. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts on the front lines because you have manpower problems. Yeah, he said that. He didn't specify the Hungarians, but the Hungarians talk about that. The Hungarians said, yeah, they're going into Transcarpathia, into territories that are really, they look like Hungary. I mean, they don't look much like Orthodox Ukraine. Looks like Hungary, and they're coming and grabbing people and sending them to the front. They're asking Hungarians to lay down their lives for Ukraine. And where are we? Yep. And then Ergos says, I respect your view on the presence of the U.S. at the Istanbul talks. I do not share your opinion. There's no defined strategy by the U.S. for a grand bargain in Europe. Trump has indicated for 100 days that he's wavering. The U.S. will merely impede, and Trump will own it. Thank you. Well, we'll see. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I think, at the very least, one has to acknowledge, and I know people have difficulties acknowledging it, Trump has transformed U.S. policy on Ukraine. U.S. policy on Ukraine up until January the 20th, 2025 was, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, continue this fight, territorial integrity, sovereignty, Ukraine within its 1991 borders, Russia to be driven out of Ukraine, Russia's this great threat to Europe, Ukraine is on the, fighting the Russians on our behalf. All of that was the position of the Biden administration. I mean, anybody who says that Trump has just continued with that policy is just absurd. They just, I'm afraid that is a classic case of Trump derangement syndrome. Trump has completely transformed it. His view now, the American position now, is this war needs to end. That's exact opposite of Biden's position. The Biden position was we need to continue with this war. And so given that the Trump view is that, well, this needs to end, what can we settle on? Where can we find some common ground to end it? Now, you can say, they'll never find any common ground. Okay, maybe. That's of course a very dismal, pessimistic view, and it may be correct. I'm not going around predicting what will happen. However, maybe they can find some common ground. Maybe the issue of a major security conference is a possibility. If that doesn't work out, then I think they would have to deal with the issue of the oblasts, see if whether Ukraine can make concessions on the oblast. That might be a way for peace. If that doesn't work out, then I guess the war continues. That's to no one's advantage. That's to no one's advantage. The notion that Russia's going to just win, you know, the day after tomorrow. Um, we've heard this for 3 years. I wouldn't put any money on that, and particularly not if the United States decides then to throw everything it has for Ukraine, which Trump isn't doing now. Anyway, Vic Shakapopoulos, okay, good to see you. And Vic says about the notion of the U.S. winning military in Vietnam, I continue to disagree with your take. The Americans have inflicted enormous casualties on the Vietnamese, and they scored many victories, but it doesn't mean anything in the end because war is not a death match, but mainly a contest of will. I don't disagree with that. I mean, what I was saying is, is that militarily, the United States won. I said right away, but politically, it didn't win. And you're right. If you just win militarily, but you're unable to win politically, then it doesn't count for very much. If the United States were able to, accomplish what they did against the Viet Cong and to create in Saigon a government that had some popular following, a government that was halfway competent and knew how to fight, knew how to raise an army, knew something about military strategy, and would know how to defend the country, which is the political part of winning. Then I think America could have said, "Well, we achieved about all we could have achieved." But the Americans only achieved one part of it. I think they were able to defeat the Viet Cong. But the other part, they didn't. And that's why eventually Americans paid the price in 1975 when the South Vietnamese government just collapsed really without putting up any kind of a fight. And then Vic says, by the 1970s, the U.S. soldiers were totally demoralized and were fragging their own officers. Well, yeah, I think that's true. But at that time, so they had won the war. I mean, the demoralization that had taken place was a result, in a sense, that the Nixon administration has already committed itself to withdrawing from Vietnam. I mean, Nixon announced the Vietnamization policy in 1969. So any American soldier who was in Vietnam after 1969 had to live with in the shadow of being the last American to get killed in Vietnam. I mean, once you're no longer fighting for any clear objectives, because Americans by this time, they really didn't know what's the objective. What are we fighting for now? We're going to leave. We're already on the way of leaving, but we're still here for some reason. We're still being asked to risk our lives, even though essentially, America is already committed to withdrawing. Then that leads to demoralization. So that was the problem, that by the Vietnamization policy was now leading to demoralization. There was no demoralization from the years in the years 67, 68. So if you look at when were American soldiers suffering the heaviest casualties, that was in 1967 and 1968. But there was no demoralization then. The Americans were suffering heavy casualties, but they weren't demoralized. The demoralization came about when essentially no one really even knew what exactly are we fighting for. I mean, we're going to leave anyway. So why exactly are we now risking our lives for what? And that was the why the demoralization took place. So that had nothing to do with whether winning or losing. As I say, when Americans were suffering the heaviest casualties, as in the Hamburger Hill, in that film Hamburger Hill. Hamburger Hill was a classic case where Americans really suffered enormous casualties. There was no demoralization. They actually went, to try to take Hamburger Hill. But after that, the U.S. government said, well, we can't have any more of these Hamburger Hill type battles. We can't go around throwing away American lives. Once they made that decision, that's in a way when demoralization began. You always need to get soldiers motivated. If soldiers are motivated, they can live with heavy casualties. But when they're kind of sitting around doing nothing, that's when they get demoralized. It was about on the home front, the level of division was approaching social breakdown point. Yeah, the divisions. Yeah, but the division was part of it. Was essentially America had given up on its objectives, during the Nixon years. The draft was still in existence. I mean, you have to kind of remember that people were still getting drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. That was always a bad idea. Not something that's not the mistake Russia's doing now, which is to send conscripts into the front line. I mean, it's always a bad idea sending conscripts. Conscripts are not good fighters. They haven't had the proper training, and they're going to get their heads blown off as soon as they reach the front. So it was very, it was now become at home very, very unpopular. And just like the Germans in World War I were not totally defeated, they were totally defeated. Germany was defeated, absolutely defeated on the battlefield. I don't know why you're saying this. You said this last time, and I told you, they were absolutely defeated on the Western Front. That there was just simply they had nothing to do. I mean, why do you think the Germans sued for peace? That's not the German style. Germans don't sue for peace. They were sued for peace because they were completely defeated. And the fact that it was far away from Berlin, that doesn't matter. That they're far from Berlin. The front lines had been penetrated. It was just a matter of time. Once the Allied armies, and now they had the Americans there, they could just go through to Berlin. The fact that they weren't in Berlin doesn't mean that Germany was not defeated. Germany was absolutely defeated. And the conditions of the armistice weren't just, oh, well, hey, we'll stop shooting. The conditions of the armistice was Germany had to surrender all of its weapons. All of its weapons, everything, all of its ships, everything, every single gun, had to be surrendered to the Allies. They wouldn't have done that if they hadn't been defeated. Anyway, on paper, the German army was far from being beaten. No. I mean, German army was beaten. I mean, I don't know. The Germans were controlling vast areas. They were controlling vast areas, but they were defeated. The unconditional surrender was a kind of a newish innovation, which up until then, no one had ever done that. No one had ever demanded unconditional surrender, as happened in World War II. But if the conditions of the armistice are that you simply give up all of your weapons to your enemy armies, that's as close to unconditional surrender as you can get. Because not only did they have to give up their arms, but there was no obligation on the part of the Allies to do anything to ease the burden on the Germans. So the Allies continued with their blockade of the ports in Germany. So that the Allies said, we're not going to end our blockade, but you have to surrender your arms. They were defeated. I mean, that's just no. The U.S. in Vietnam also had no prospect of victory. The U.S. had no prospect of victory because the U.S. had limited its objectives. I mean, the U.S. could have defeated North Vietnam very, very easily. I mean, come on. The U.S. had defeated Japan. They defeated Germany. Of course, they could have defeated North Vietnam. North Vietnam was a very backward country, let's say. They fought with great tenacity, and there's no question of that. But of course, the U.S. could have defeated North Vietnam. The U.S. had chosen not to do that. The U.S. had elected to fight a very, very limited war um, limited to the south, and limited to try to defeat a communist insurgency in the south and secure a non-communist or anti-communist South Vietnam that would be able to defend itself in future against communist insurgencies. That's all the United States tried to do. They didn't try to defeat North Vietnam. They never made no attempt. No attempt. They never invaded North Vietnam. And even the bombing that they did bomb North Vietnam. It was always just tactical bombing to hamper North Vietnam's help to the Viet Cong. It was really just about helping the Viet Cong. So it's misleading to say the U.S. had no prospect of victory. The U.S. elected to wage a very limited war in South Vietnam. And as I say, militarily, they did achieve that. They did defeat the guerrilla, the insurgency in the South. I think that was accomplished. They defeated even when North Vietnam invaded the South in Easter 1972. That was accomplished. The United States was able to defeat that invasion. The other part of it is which was the political part, which is to have a government in Saigon that would be able to defend itself against the North, against the communists. That part was not achieved. That was not accomplished. So the war had certainly the war definitely was become very unpopular, but not because there was no prospect of victory, but because Americans had come a bit disgusted. I mean, they're fighting against North Vietnam, a very poor, weak country, and there was no real reason to do so. I mean, no one could any longer find the rationale, which maybe there had been when it started in the 1950s, the Cold War, and it was important to stop communist expansion everywhere, wherever we went, everywhere. But by 1970, no one really thought that. Well, what's so important about it? Why do we have to stop communism in South Vietnam? I mean, what huge stakes are there? So, those are political arguments. They're not military arguments. Militarily, the United States won. I mean, that I don't know why it's so difficult to accept that, but politically, the United States failed. Anyway, so military objectives cannot exist in a vacuum. Well, those were the war went on for some time. When it first started, it seemed like this war against the communists is being fought everywhere. Every part of the world, you have to fight against the communists. There was a global communist threat, which seemed to have some resonance when it started in the mid 1950s, when Eisenhower talked about the domino theory and so on. That was 1954. By 1970, it's 15 years later. There've been a lot of things that changed in the world, and the United States really no longer thought that this was that important, and it wasn't that important anymore. But all of that, those are political issues that are separate from the military issue, which is the United States won in Vietnam, won in South Vietnam. It had the limited military objectives that it had set, which is to defeat the communist insurgency, the United States accomplished. Anyway, Mark says, explain Munich's 2025 security speech fully backed by Trump as part of Project 2025. Mark says, Vietnam War bankrupted America. How did it bankrupt America? It continues its economic dominance of the world. Never really changed. It did absolutely bring in inflation. Inflation was an absolute problem, and that naturally had its effects. Yeah, I mean that's what happens when you. But that was other things. There were other reasons why America was suffering inflation. I mean, this was Lyndon Johnson pursued a guns and butter policy. Well, a lot of governments do that. Guns and butter. You can't do it. You have to pay for it. And so and that's what happened. They so and eventually the Americans had to address the inflation problem, which they did, and that was all very very painful. Anyway, that was all very very interesting. Wondering somewhat far afield on the jungles of Southeast Asia. But we can do that. Anyway, thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you for all of your very very interesting and insightful questions. Always interested to discuss history and politics and geography and culture. So whatever. So anyway, thank you so much everybody. Thank you above all to those who put something into the tip jar. The dogs are really, we don't care about culture, we don't care about politics, we don't care about anything. We just give us money. Whatever you got, just give us money. That's their view. Very hard to argue with them. Anyway, thank you so much. And we're going to do this again on Thursday, by which time we'll probably have some idea what happened in Istanbul. So we're going to discuss the events in Istanbul on Thursday. So until then, all the best. Thank you. Good night. See you soon.